This is a story about George the mean yellow dog. George the mean yellow dog and the silly mosquito, to be precise. George lives in fluffy gardens, a wonderful place to live. Our story begins with an interruption. After a football match, the players were cooling themselves down with drinks and were laughing about how much fun the game had been. George, the mean yellow dog, had scored 2 goals and was feeling rather good about it. He was almost smiling, which is quite unusual for George. He was edging towards a good mood and was just about to tell everyone when he was interrupted by a loud noise. A horn. Lola the mosquito was walking backwards around the pitch, wearing a selection of fine cheeses and blowing into a large French horn. She looked and sounded very silly. Very silly indeed. But Lola the mosquito was having a lot of fun. Everyone laughed and clapped when they saw Lola. Well, not everyone. George hated being interrupted, and he especially hated anything silly. He stormed up to Lola, took away her French horn and shouted, "I hate that! Stop being so silly! All you are is silly!" Well, now he wasn't anywhere near a good mood. In fact, you could say he was in a foul mood. And you'd be right. Lola looked a little sad and walked off the pitch. The next day, something odd happened. There was a knock on George's door. That's odd in itself. George hates people knocking on his door and tends to shout at anyone who does. What's even more odd is that it was Lola the mosquito. George stood, waiting for her to do something silly, ready to shout. But she didn't do anything silly, so he didn't shout. She said, "Hello, George. I brought you some breakfast." George waited to see what silly things Lola had brought for breakfast. She had brought bread for toast, some orange juice, and some lovely melon. And nothing silly. George was so surprised, he invited her in and they had breakfast together. As he ate, George told her all about the things he hated, like toast and orange juice, and especially lovely melon. Lola liked all those things, but told George that she valued his opinion. They ate and chatted together, and all the while, George was waiting for it to happen. He didn't know what it was, but he knew whatever it was going to be very silly, and Lola was going to do it any minute. But she didn't. George and Lola spent the day together. Lola showed George her favorite hat shop. She even bought George a hat that wasn't remotely silly. In fact, it made him look rather handsome. They went for a walk together over the hills, and Lola walked forwards, not backwards. George drove her around the town, pointing out everyone he hated. That took 3 hours. Lola, being curious, asked him to point out everyone he didn't hate. And 20 seconds later, they were having lunch at a lovely restaurant. All the while, George was sure she was going to do something silly. He knew it. any minute she would do something totally silly, like put a lampshade on her head, or sing a song about a fly wearing welly boots, or flip upside down and do Morris dancing while standing on her head. Just when he thought it was going to happen, it didn't. And then it didn't again. The suspense was driving him crazy. By the end of lunch, George, the mean yellow dog, was a nervous wreck. Lola picked up her napkin. George watched. She patted the sides of her mouth. And that is when he snapped. George jumped off his chair and bounced up and down, shouting, "You're silly! Always silly! So do something sillier. Play a flute with your nose. Wrap yourself in orange peel. Dance the cha-cha-cha in sequins and twigs." He was in a terrible fluster. And he looked more than a little silly. He looked sillier than Lola had been all that day. And everyone could see it. Especially George. He took a deep breath, calmed down, and whispered, "Why aren't you being silly?" Lola leaned in and whispered quietly,
You said all I am is silly. But I'm much more than that, aren't I?
George had no choice but to agree. And as it turns out, he very much enjoyed the rest of the day with Lola. And not just that day. Before long, they were spending a lot of time together. Lola the mosquito became George's very good friend. And that's the silliest thing she has ever done.